Well, good morning. Okay, we are on. Good. Good. Well, we got the old time change, blues, if you will, depending, and so everybody will be trickling in to some degree. Well, good. Well, let's as we continue on. As you remember, we've been looking at the upheaval that there was in the '60s, and these challenges to a lot of stuff in the culture. We saw what was going on, the challenge to the institutions, to the way things were done. Some of that good, maybe some of it not good, but there was just this overall challenge and upheaval, and it was affecting all kinds of things. And within the fellowship, as within other groups, there's challenges to the long-held positions and understandings of things in light of that. And so some viewed that as very bad, others viewed that as a good thing. And as we've talked about in the spectrum, everywhere in between. And so we always like to simplify and classify and say they're here, and that can be useful for discussion. But usually it's a lot more complex than that. And so it's always important that we don't just label that someone's all this or all that, because they may or may not be. And so as we try to understand this, and so as we were looking at it last time, that there were those within our fellowship that were pushing back, and those that thought certain ways. And one of the big things that was happening was the view. That restoration view that we had that empowered so many and bought into that 19th century of we need to restore the New Testament church. And of course, what did that mean? And of course, in the beginning it meant certain things, and it kind of evolved, and then some say it kind of crystallized, and so it wasn't all necessarily established and understood at this one point. It evolved and grew and so on and so forth. And so by the time, certainly we're in this time, that idea for many was considered sacred. And so the mission of restoring became as much or more important than anything else. And so any attacks on that required a vigorous defense rather than necessarily think about Christ, because that was equated with, for many, that was equated with what following Christ was restoring this particular vision. And of course, we're not all unfamiliar with some of the aspects of that. And so at the time, those that were labeling as conservatives, and remember this is just for discussion. Those that wanted to preserve that 19th century more, and those that weren't as hardcore on it, if you will, and that's the mainstream. And we've been chronicling all along these changes and different views that people had and where they were going. Well, even though the mainstreams and the conservatives still had many of the same concerns, they were kind of at a different level. And so at the time, between conservatives and mainstream, these lines of division were not as clearly drawn as they would be later on. By remaining focused and very vocal in defense of their views, the conservatives managed to exert an influence in this period that was probably greater than the numbers that held those positions. We have already seen the effectiveness of the demands of members of the Abilene College, where they tried to terminate the involvement of some of the faculty on the Mission magazine. And that was one of the magazines of those that were advocating these different understandings and changes. And so as we see played out today, the cancel culture, and it works both ways. And if there's those there that are promoting this or that, we want them out of here if that's different than what we think is important. And I'm not saying things aren't important, but I'm just saying that we see that dynamic happening here. Several other professors of Bible and religion at Harding College in Searcy and the Harding Graduate School of Religion, which of course was the upper degree that was there in Memphis for so long, and last year they closed down that campus and they moved it to Harding and Searcy, partly because there is less people going into those degrees and so on, and so that's why that happened. And at Abilene Christian were removed from their positions during this period because of complaints and agitation on the parts of those who have been labeled conservative. At David Lipscomb's college, none were terminated, but 3 faculty members resigned to escape the scrutiny that severely diminished their delight of college teaching. And so there were those that had those feelings but decided to just leave on their own rather than go through all that. Now, also what happened is that we're going to see spring up new journals, and we know that journals have a long history in our fellowship, beginning with Campbell's Christian Baptists and then Millennial Harbinger and so on and so forth, and we've chronicled many of what those were. Because they were convinced that the journals and editors within the mainstream churches of Christ were not waging the battle against modernism as effectively as they might, many conservatives felt constrained to establish new periodicals of their own. 3 in particular deserve mention, all of which in one way or another sought to defend the restoration of primitive Christianity. In other words, that goal was, it's in defense of that. As their editors understood that theme from the inroads of modernism, liberalism, and relativism of the 60s. And so we need our own. We need ones that are going to express our views. In 1967, Roy Hearn of Memphis and Franklin Camp of Birmingham launched the First Century Christian. Okay, now that title has important meaning. Why is that? We're trying to establish a New Testament church. Well, what was a major publication that was out there that had developed in the 30s? 20th Century Christian. And so we see this contrast in the title by design. A title stood, as we said, in clear juxtaposition of that of the mainstream progressive journal found in the 30s, 20th century. Significantly, the First Century Christian featured a lead article in the inaugural issue, an essay by Foye Wallace Jr., extolling the King James Version of the Bible and lamenting modernism implicit in the new translation of Scriptures. And so whether you're aware of this or not, there has obviously for some time been those that hold that the only viable version is the King James Version. And you probably heard jokes of, that was the version Jesus used and so on and so forth that people had said about it. And it certainly had a long established, history. Bill?
It's very hardcore. There's a lot of congregations in the gospel.
Yes.
Unless you're reading the King James, you're not studying in the Bible.
You're not following the true translation. Well, and so this battle, and so Bill's saying there's a congregation in Kansas City that split over whether to use the old King James, even though the old King James went through many translations from when it first came out. So sometimes, that in these arguments, sometimes that's ignored or forgotten or not known, that wait a minute, there's been changes before, or to use the new King James, which was written in a little bit less archaic, Old English, if you will, relatively to us, language. And so that's a very real thing. And there are those that feel that if you don't use that translation, you're not getting the right the right stuff. However, as one looks at and studies those issues, one has found that the King James translation was translated from less reliable texts than were discovered later, and there's a lot of flaws. You see that King James made up new terms to fit what was going on. Heaven, hell, church, ecclesia, baptism, immersion, just a lot of things. And and you can find materials that can go into great detail about that. But the point is that there are those that held so strongly, and obviously for some, that was mainly the point. And so this idea that what was before is better than anything that comes around later. And so just as a general kind of thing. And so this was strong. And so when you're in the middle of that kind of battle, you start seeing it everywhere, in everything. And it's very interesting. Now, in 1969, Thomas B. Warren, who was a professor at Freed-Hardeman in Henderson, Tennessee, and Rubel Shelley, which is a name that probably more of us are familiar with, launched the spiritual sword. And Warren had earned a doctorate from Vanderbilt in philosophy, and Shelley earned the same degree from Vanderbilt in 1981. So the spiritual sword was one of those publications. As already noted, Rubel Shelley adopted more of what was considered the progressive positions shortly after this. Even though he had launched this, he didn't stay in that way of looking at things. But at this point, both men stood squarely in the traditions of that Lockean, John Locke, empiricism, that rational, common sense, Scottish realism of the Enlightenment that we have talked extensively about. And this is facts. This is basically you're looking at it like you would scientifically examine anything. And both were concerned to resist this relativistic philosophies that were started in the 50s. I don't know if start is the right word, but it became stronger, and in the 60s exploded, challenging all these foundations of Western understanding, if you will, that was going on. And you can understand. We could think of our own lives that have been there. When all of a sudden something cherished, what's the natural reaction? You dig in. You resist. And that might be called for. And at other times, but it often keeps us from even listening to maybe what the other points are. And then we can maybe determine whether in our minds that's valid or not valid. But anyhow, and they continued to resist the relativistic philosophies that undermined what they viewed as the cardinal principle of the Restoration heritage, and that was the notions that human beings can know absolute truth absolutely. Now, that's really saying a lot. Okay, because remember, the Enlightenment, this empiricism, this common sense rationalism, gave a confidence, some would say a false confidence, in our ability to rationally understand all these things perfectly, or close to it. And there was much confidence in that. And so there were those that said we're able to do that by and we've talked about hermeneutic. Our particular hermeneutic was key in that and held up. And anybody that went against that way of looking at it you're in trouble. But this idea that we could absolutely know absolute truth, know all the things that are needed to know. And you know what? That can be a very enticing quality. I remember as a young man, as I'm being studied with in the Scriptures and things like that, and all these things come in the light that I never knew, and learning and making sense. That made sense that was possible to me. It was only after a long time and experience, as we all know, sometimes that youthful exuberance is kind of tempered by kind of the realities of things. But anyhow, so that was critical here. And that is why the idea of debate, and really it's about the argument, and it's how right you understand things, and this is why this is right and that is not right, and all those things. It comes from this basic understanding. In the yes, Bill.
Go a little deeper than that.
Okay.
This is a gift of the Holy Spirit.
Uh-huh.
In it indwells all the knowledge we need to know. But a very high percentage of these conservatives of that age and even today
Uh-huh.
don't believe that the Holy Spirit is there to guide you on your way. They don't believe that the Holy Spirit interacts with you the way I believe the Holy Spirit interacts with me.
And we're going to get to that.
Okay, that's coming.
We might not get there today, but we are going to get into that exactly thing. In other words, how does the Holy Spirit work?
I can't imagine me being able to delve into this and really fully understand without the assistance of the Holy Spirit.
Which Paul writes us and says that's what and Jesus says, and also, that these things are, the Spirit is there to help, and so on and so forth. But yes, we're going to get into that in some detail. So don't forget that, but it's not today. I don't think we'll get that far. In the opening editorial, Warren explained this journal is launched both in determined opposition to skepticism, liberalism, and relativism, and in strong affirmation that the Bible is the infallible, inspired Word of God, and that men can learn to obey the truth. So they're just stating this is what we're trying to, what we're trying to do. Finally, and Carl, here's a guy new. In 1970, Ira Rice Jr. Have anybody other than Carl heard of Ira Rice? Is that name familiar to anybody? No? Just Carl. Okay. He was a former missionary in Singapore who had returned to Nashville and had launched perhaps the most flamboyant and sensational of the new journals, Contending for the Faith. Have any of us seen the Contending for the Faith journal? Bill, did you ever see that? His publication? Carl? You definitely have.
Some refer to it as contentious for the faith.
Contentious for the faith. Rice announced his intention to join the mortal struggle now raging, and so this is framed in their minds in these deep, ways. Between those who really believe the Restoration movement and those founding principles and desires and understandings, and what the New Testament teaches, and those who really do not believe it, but would liberalize it beyond all recognition. And so what's happening is a defense of the premise of what the Restoration movement was about. And of course, that's equating with, that's what following the gospel in Jesus is. And there would be those that would say, well, no, maybe it's not. But anyhow, before Contending for the Faith, Rice had published 3 volumes, what was called Acts on the Root. Has anyone ever seen those books? And the purpose was to expose the people and the institutions he thought responsible for the liberalizing trends in all quarters of the churches of Christ, but especially in colleges. In his new journal, Rice embraced the wholesale tactical strategies of Foye Wallace. And we talked about this a while back when we were looking at him intently, who wanted to identify the heretics in print by name, rank, and serial number. He wanted to call people out. He wanted to name names. And Rice singled out Mission Magazine as the voice of apostasy among churches of Christ because it was advocating things different from what it had been. And Rice's chief purpose in his second volume of Acts on the Root, in fact, was to expose mission before it began publication. Now, this was printed in the 60s, later, second half of the 60s, I think these three came out. I remember as a young man in college up in Kirksville, at least I think that's where it was, as of mine, there was a brother there that, have you ever seen this book, Acts on the Root? And so we were sitting there reading it. Now we up there were in a campus ministry that had connections to what was called the Crossroads movement at the time, and so it was innovating in a campus ministry, and it would be those that might say were embracing these much more progressive outlooks of things. Now again, as Ira Rice, Acts on the Root, I had no context of that. I had no whatever. And I remember in the dorm room, we were kind of reading it, and we were kind of laughing at some of these things and charges that were being brought in the magazine. Now, of course, it's not like we're highly mature and knowledgeable, of things and context, but nonetheless. And so these are some of those things that are going on. Well, there's also going to be establishment of new schools. And so the New Conservatives did not just establish new papers, they also established new schools, which were specifically preacher training schools. And in part, these schools that were established in response to the widespread feeling that Churches of Christ-related colleges were not producing enough preachers to keep up with the rapid increase in membership following World War II. And we said after the war, things exploded everywhere, every group. And so there was just this great need. People were all going back to churches and all kinds of stuff. But there was more to the preacher phenomena than that. Conservatives had lost faith in the ability of Churches of Christ-related colleges, especially Abilene, seemed to be a particular target, to produce acceptable pulpit preachers. Now, there you got a very subjective word, acceptable. The conservatives were convinced that such institutions were hotbeds of the sort of biblical and theological scholarship that characterized the progressive movement, and that, as a result, they were now producing scholars rather than preachers. Now, one might say, what is that difference? Is one bad or the other? Now, we can understand these dynamics from one level. We can see it playing out today. We see what are the things that they're teaching up in the colleges that are causing the folks to do all the rioting and all this kind of stuff now. And so this idea that these things are coming from these higher institutions, these ideas, and spreading it is not that's where a lot of those ideas come from, whether you agree with them or you don't agree with them. And so that idea isn't totally nuts. But what we see is we see a blaming and just an outright dismissing of things, and we just see this being played out here. Historically, Churches of Christ have never required academic degrees for preachers. They have never been any requirements beyond those established by the local congregation. In the 19th century, more and more preachers, but by no means all, prepared for their task by taking 4-year liberal arts curriculum, possibly majoring in, pay no attention to that, because that's not accurate, and possibly majoring in Bible and religion. And so let us remember, we were a frontier religion, fellowship, the Restoration movement. And so there wasn't then the access to the schools by masses and more. And so there was you studied, you read, you heard, and so on, and then you had that desire, you went out and preached. And so there wasn't that academic training that was not only available at the time, but you couldn't get to it. For most cases. And of course, Alexander Campbell formed Bethany, and we said, others formed Bacon College and so on and so forth. And so those were the beginnings of those things. It's not that there weren't educated men, but as far as the masses. Now, it's really interesting that because of this thinking, which was not totally new, there has been in our fellowship over its history, for some, what they almost call an anti-intellectual. In other words, there was an attitude against those that were trained. Now, in our experiences in college, you could see that it was viewed in the Crossroads movement, later the Boston movement. We're going to talk more about that down the road. But there was this view that, hey, the schools are not producing people that are being real serious Christians. And so there was kind of an attitude against, if you'd gone to school for your degree, you're missing something, meaning for Bible training. And that it's that practical training of doing it that is more important. And so that was deeply held there until they decided they wanted that kind of accreditation themselves. But that's another story. And so we see this happening here. A few who taught in these programs in Churches of Christ-related colleges had earned doctorate degrees in religion from recognized universities, but many had not. And by the 60s, more and more professors in these programs were beneficiaries of having had this higher level training and education, especially in biblical studies. And some congregations found these changes threatening and unacceptable. And as we talked about a couple weeks ago, to get accreditation, to be able to teach certain levels, like they have master's degrees, you got to have people that have doctorate degrees. And so our schools didn't have those doctorate degrees because we didn't have the doctoral level people. And so what had happened, I think we discussed, and we'll discuss some more, is that there were those that sent our people to the Harvards, to the Yales, to the Dukes, to these places that had those levels, though were not part of our fellowship, and they got their degrees and then came back to our schools to establish the master's and doctorate level or whatever degrees. And so it was this process over time, and it was beginning to happen now. As you know, most of our schools back in the 60s were called colleges. And of course, what are they now? They're universities. And so we see this progression. In no case was this hostility toward theological scholarship more apparent than in Ira Rice's journal, Contending for the Faith. Rice had returned from a mission tour of Singapore in 1965 to study Mandarin Chinese at Yale in New Haven. So, okay, here you got a guy, missionary, going to study a very difficult language, if you will, and he's going to Yale. So you got to be a smart person to get into Yale. They wouldn't let me in there. I might get to walk the campus, and did a few years ago, but that was probably the extent. But anyhow, in New Haven, he encountered two Yale divinity students, Robert M. Randolph and Durwood Smith, and a local preacher called Bob Howard, whose perspectives troubled him greatly. In other words, these are those who were members of the church. I kept hearing reference, Rice later wrote, to the best divinity schools, and kept asking myself how a denominational or secular so-called divinity school can be even good, better, or best. In one instant, one of the students used the word Christendom in such a way that the true church was lumped with those in error. And so for Rice's way of looking at things from that exclusive look of we got the truth, we're the ones that are presenting it right, these are denominations, which were looked at, as we know, in a very negative light, and he meant members of the church who were up there who had been affected by that. And now, face it, they're in colleges. They're getting advanced degrees. Those things are important to them. They pay attention to who's the best divinity, who's, did you go to Harvard? Did you go to Yale? Did you go here? Did you go? So you see those things that are kind of natural in one sense. Anyhow, these things very much disturbed Ira Rice at how they could even be talking about this. And so that's affecting him. Another made it appear that Martin Luther was a Christian. The Churches of Christ are just a denomination. Again, things that are challenging what was always said. Rice was so distressed that in 1966 he issued a volume entitled Axe and the Root, which we mentioned, in which he attacked not only Randolph and Smith and Howard, but graduate education in general, especially in religion and theology. And he suggested it was probably impossible for young Christian students to attend secular or sectarian divinity schools and to come out untainted. Over the next years, he issued 2 more volumes of Axe and the Root, and all 3 sold well. And so this was touching a note in a lot of folks. His distrust of higher education became a central theme in the pages of Contending in the Faith. He claimed that the concern among Churches of Christ-related colleges for academic accreditation, in other words, your desire to be accredited in the eyes of the world, was the primary source of infiltration by liberalism and modernism. It would appear that Abilene's seduction by accreditation is practically complete, he wrote, and what is true at ACC largely has already become true at several of our other campuses or rapidly heading in that direction. And so this thinking was permeating and spreading like a contagion among the different schools. And so that was creating great angst. Rice and the other new conservatives were hardly alone in their distrust of theological scholarship. Dismissive assessments of such scholarship routinely appeared in the Firm Foundation and the Gospel Advocate. There was others that were concerned about what are some of these ideas. Kind of bothered them. Even though the growing numbers of preachers in the mainstream churches were employing the results of modern technological scholarship in the pulpit. In other words, they're speaking about things that are learning, that are coming out and discussing those in the pulpit, rather than just the things that were before. In fact, they are mentioning people such as Newbar, Barth, Cox, and Bonhoeffer. In other words, these were very well-known theologians that were in other groups that had great influence in the 20th century and maybe the 19th on how they overlap, and attributed to the spread. In other words, these ideas from these other guys are getting into your heads, and you're talking about them, and they're making sense. And so they attributed the spread of verbalism to graduate education and specifically attacked Rudolf Bultmann's call for demythologizing, I'm saying that's a big word, the New Testament as subversive of the entire restoration vision of the Churches of Christ. Now, every one of you are probably saying, who is that and what does that mean? And I get it. Yes?
Who is that? What does that mean?
I was going to tell you. He was a German theologian, so all of a sudden that meets with great distrust, because in the 19th century, out of Germany came a lot of what was called that higher criticism, where they're challenging everything in the Bible, the virgin birth, the miracles, all these kind of things, that had a lot of influence in theology across the board, if you will. And so that's who this person is. He wasn't part of that group. And he came up with this concept that, and I'm going to probably get this wrong because I looked over it many times and it's still not real clear to me. But he's saying that, you know what? They wrote about their times, the events, the particular, the miracle, all this kind of stuff. And they didn't have the benefit of modern scientific understandings of things that we have. And so what's really important is, what did Jesus say? What about his crucifixion? And of course the resurrection. And that is the most important stuff. And we don't need to get caught up in times and dates and specific miracles, if I understand. That's kind of what that's saying. So he's not, throwing all this out or whatever. He's saying, let's quit concentrating on these mythological type things. And in other words, one of the complaints that the King James folks had was when you had some of the newer translations, and I can't remember which ones off the top of my head, where we see that they're demon-possessed. One of the stories of Jesus healing a demon-possessed guy because they're flopping around and all this. Well, some of these newer translations seem to imply it was really epilepsy. In other words, there is a rational explanation for some of this. And so that's kind of what he's dealing with. And so he's saying, let's not get all caught up into some of those details, and let's remember these large ideas and statements in following Christ. Now, I can't sit here and explain all that and all that means or whatever, but that was just one of the comments. Bill?
There's some similarity what you're talking about here to what Thomas Jefferson did. Okay?
Where he cut out all the miracles?
I went to Monticello, I saw a death with all these Bibles torn apart.
Yeah.
And he put together an ultimate red letter edition, and he wanted to just study the words of Jesus and not what all the other hoopla was all about.
Yeah. Yeah, Jefferson was famous for having done that, and there's differing views on what that meant.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, some view it as he's just, this, and others are, and so, who knows exactly. But you're right. I would say that would be part of this general type of thinking, even though that happened quite a bit before.
Not understanding the moment that this was all, the whole idea behind mythology being used in the context of Christ is bothersome.
Well, yeah. Now, and it depends on how you define mythology. In other words, is it something that was just totally fake and just made up? Or is it, can it be a certain understanding of whatever? And so it gets complicated, and you got to define terms. And depending who you're talking to, it may mean something different. I'm just telling you. Convinced that many liberal arts colleges related to Churches of Christ were no longer training preachers sufficiently orthodox in the faith, a variety of congregations were determined to establish their own schools of preaching. To train new preachers, Ira Rice argued that preaching schools would never have arisen if the churches supposed to be Christian colleges had been faithfully performing their function of training both the number and the kind of men required as ministers in the churches. Glenn Wallace, and I can't remember if Glenn was Foy's brother or his son. I think it's his son. But Glenn Wallace, writing in the Firm Foundation, concurred. The growing number of preacher training schools reflects deficiency among us. He wrote, our Bible departments in some colleges are being overloaded with Harvard specialists. That's a derogatory phrase. Many are tainted with secular philosophy and are totally ignorant of the sickness in our land. They speak not in a relevant message, but in intellectual nothingness, just plain denominational terms. In other words, all these things against what has always been taught and whatever in our fellowship, this is not it. Schools that grew from this motivation included the Memphis School of Preaching, which is not the Memphis Graduate School of Theology that we've already mentioned. This is a separate thing. The Brown Trail School of Preaching, which is in Fort Worth, and the Bear Valley School of Preaching, which was near the Bear Valley Bible Institute in Denver. And I think all of these are still in existence. And we've had people apply here from there and different things. Other schools of preaching grew from a somewhat different motivation. The Sunset School of Preaching in Lubbock, Texas. Now, that is not the same as Lubbock Christian College, where Scotty graduated from, meaning it's a separate. And I think it was run by the Sunset Church of Christ. And I remember when I was in college, there was a really well-known guy that taught at this, Richard Rogers. Maybe you had heard of his name. And first came across him at, when we were in the Crossroads stuff. They used to have what was called evangelism seminars, and we were at a big one in Chicago. And they had him up. And so what they were doing is they had Jerry Jones up. And there was what they were doing is they were pulling scholars from various places within the mainstream and other places who were sympathetic with what was going on, or at least interested in, and they would have them come and speak to these gatherings. And so anyhow, that was Sunset. And the Whites Ferry Road School of Preaching in West Monroe, Louisiana. And we had an elder at the church in Kirksville that it was from that. He was a doctor. And that is also where, the Robertson family of Duck Dynasty fame, that's where they were located, at the big Whites Ferry Road Church. And tended by the mid-'70s toward a warm evangelical pietism, and Sunset in particular emphasized a strong theology of grace. And so I would say these two schools had a little different bent from the other three we just mentioned. In other words, you see these preaching schools forming, but they weren't all exactly the same. Preaching schools typically focused entirely on the Bible. In other words, all the curriculum was Bible. You weren't taking English lit or non-biblical history or something like that, like you would, at a regular college. And did not require completion of additional courses, as we said in liberal arts. Roy Hearn, editor of First Century Christian, described the curriculum of the Getwell Road School of Preaching in Memphis, which later became Memphis School of Preaching. During 2 years of intensive study, the Bible is the main text and is covered thoroughly by textual study, largely verse by verse. At least 3 other courses gave a survey of the Bible, making 4 times it was covered. 48 courses were offered in the Bible and related subjects, and a Bible geography, church history, homiletics, preaching, introduction, and Christian evidences. In other words, it was totally focused, intense curriculum. So because these are schools, weren't the colleges, it doesn't mean this stuff wasn't challenging, difficult, and required a lot from you, because it did. These schools of preaching had influenced a large segment of our fellowship already by the 1970s. According to Batsell Barrett Baxter's statistics, and he spoke on the Herald of Truth, as you recall, Baxter identified 10 schools of preaching operating within the United States, these kind of schools, in 1970. According to Baxter's statistic, these schools trained over 25% of all the students studying to preach among churches of Christ, whether it be this wing or that wing or whatever. Many of these schools were established by people who stood squarely in the more conservative wing of our tradition. Okay, so they're going there. And so so we will stop because we're out of time. And then next week we're going to get into the Holy Spirit that Bill had already brought up. I didn't think we were going to get to it next week. And so this is going to be very interesting because what we're going to talk about is what the view was pretty standard at one time, but isn't quite like this now because we're on this side of a lot of that. And so we'll have some good discussion on that. So thank you very much. Any questions or statements or comment, Bill?